So I decided we're going to read a little essay together. If you don't want to do that right now, you don't really have to watch the video. Sometimes I'm not sure how people feel about reading, but this is an essay that I think is worthwhile. It's by a Christian naturalist um, and essayist named Wendell Berry, and it was published in 1993 in the journal Cross Currents. It's for a class I'm taking called Christianity and Ecology, where we're trying to examine the ways in which Christianity is responsible for the Christian worldview generally, the Christian mythos, even if you don't call yourself a Christian, as Barry will describe. You're caught up in that cultural matrix. Even as an atheist, you're responding to um, a Christian cultural context in order to define yourself. So in this class, we're looking at what may have caused the ecological crisis and also what solutions may be lying dormant within the Christian tradition itself, which is a very complex monster. Christianity is an amalgam of all kinds of things, beliefs, practices, traditions, Greek traditions, Judaic traditions, um, European medieval traditions, and it's hard to really tell what people mean when they use the phrase, but there is a deeper archetypal structure to the Christian um, mythos and to Christian theology that I think um, is in many ways perennial. And there is certainly a unity of all the major wisdom traditions. When I say major, I mean those which have spread beyond a single culture. The universal uh, religions like Buddhism and Christianity and Islam. Um, these are religions which don't require that you belong to a certain tribe or people. They spread across tribes and peoples and races and nations. And there are others that I haven't mentioned. There's a unity between these universal religions, but there's also a sort of evolution which is taking place. And, you know, in some ways, what we call Buddhism as an idea, system of ideas, which is more an invention of Western anthropologists than it is, something that corresponds to the actual beliefs and practices of particular communities of practicing Buddhists. Buddhism is often more evolved in some of its um, exemplifications than is Christianity. And it goes both ways, though, and likewise across all the religions. So when we talk about the evolution of religion as a sort of counterpoint to the perenniality, the eternality, and the universality of religion, I think we're pointing to a spirit which moves through every religion. And part of that spirit, I think, in terms of the directionality and the goal towards which um, religious life is oriented is, in a sense, it's love, right? But it's the kind of love that, well, in the Buddhist case, there's the Bodhisattva's vow, where, one becomes enlightened, escaping from or just allowing to dissolve the samsaric um, circling of suffering and thirst and lust. The enlightened one escapes that and enters into nirvana, which again is just like a release of what was never really there in the first place. But then the bodhisattva goes back into that round of suffering because of their compassion, because of their desire to suffer with others, that is, their desire to love. I think the notion of the incarnation in Christianity, of God becoming flesh, becoming human and dying, is very similar archetypally to this notion of the bodhisattva in Buddhism. And to the extent that a religion emphasizes not only the transcendent, but the integration of the transcendent with uh, the earthly, with the immanent, with the here and now, um, I think that is a more evolved religious impulse and expression. Um, and in that sense, I am a Christian and a Buddhist and a Muslim and a Taoist and a Vedantin and so on, to the extent that the recognition of um, the essentiality of love and that the desire to help and to be with others and to learn from others is in fact the basis of our reality and the purpose of our existence. Um, that's what evolved religion means to me. But I'm supposed to be reading Wendell Berry. So let's get to this essay here. It's called Christianity and the Survival of Creation. Berry begins. I confess that I have not invariably been comfortable in front of a pulpit. I have never been comfortable behind one. To be behind a pulpit is always a forcible reminder to me that I am an essayist, and in many ways a dissenter. An essayist is, literally, a writer who attempts to tell the truth. Preachers must resign themselves to being either right or wrong. An essayist, when proved wrong, may claim to have been just practicing. An essayist is privileged to speak without institutional authorization. A dissenter, of course, must speak without privilege. I want to begin with a problem, namely, that the culpability of Christianity in the destruction of the natural world and the uselessness of Christianity to any effort to correct that destruction are now established cliches of the conservation movement. This is a problem for two reasons. First, the indictment of Christianity by the anti-Christian conservationists is, in many respects, just. For instance, the complicity of Christian priests, preachers, and missionaries in the cultural destruction and the economic exploitation of the primary peoples of the Western Hemisphere, as well as of traditional cultures around the world, is notorious. Throughout the 500 years since Columbus's first landfall in the Bahamas, the evangelist has walked beside the conqueror and the merchant, too often blandly assuming that his cause was the same as theirs. Blind, that must be blindly. Christian organizations to this day remain largely indifferent to the rape and plunder of the world and of its traditional cultures. It is hardly too much to say that most Christian organizations are as happily indifferent as most industrial organizations to the ecological, cultural, and religious implications of industrial economics. The certified Christian seems just as likely as anyone else to join the military-industrial conspiracy to murder creation. The conservationist indictment of Christianity is a problem, secondly, because, however just it may be, it does not come from an adequate understanding of the Bible and the cultural traditions that descend from the Bible. The anti-Christian conservationists characteristically deal with the Bible by waving it off, and this dismissal conceals, as such dismissals are apt to do, an ignorance that invalidates it. The Bible is an inspired book, written by human hands. As such, it is certainly subject to criticism, but the anti-Christian environmentalists have not mastered the first rule of the criticism of books. You have to read them before you criticize them. Our predicament now, I believe, requires us to learn to read and understand the Bible in light of the present fact of creation. This would seem to be a requirement both for Christians and for everyone concerned, but it entails a long work of true criticism, that is, careful and judicious study and not dismissal. It entails, furthermore, the making of a very precise distinction between biblical instruction and the behavior of those people supposed to have been biblically instructed. I cannot pretend, obviously, to have made so meticulous a study. If I were capable of it, I would not live long enough to do it. But I have attempted to read the Bible with some of these issues in mind, and I see some virtually catastrophic discrepancies between biblical instruction and Christian behavior. I don't mean disreputable Christian behavior either. The discrepancies I see are between biblical instruction and allegedly respectable Christian behavior. If, because of these discrepancies, Christianity were dismissible, there would, of course, be no problem. We could simply dismiss it, along with the 20 centuries of unsatisfactory history attached to it, and start setting things to rights. The problem emerges only when we ask, where then would we turn for instruction? We might, let us suppose, turn to another religion, a recourse that is sometimes suggested by the anti-Christian environmentalists. Buddhism, for example, is certainly a religion that could guide us toward a right respect for the natural world, our fellow humans, and our fellow creatures. I have a considerable debt myself to Buddhism and Buddhists, but there is an enormous number of people, and I am one of them, whose native religion, for better or worse, is Christianity. We were born to it. We began to learn about it before we became conscious. It is, whatever we may think of it, an intimate belonging of our being. It informs our consciousness, our language, and our dreams. We can turn away from it or against it, but that will only bind us tightly to a reduced version of it. A better possibility is that this, our native religion, should survive and renew itself, so that it may become as largely and truly instructive as we need it to be. On such a survival and renewal of the Christian religion may depend the survival of that creation which is its subject. If we read the Bible, keeping in mind the desirability of those two survivals, of Christianity and the creation, we are apt to discover several things that modern Christian organizations have kept remarkably quiet about, or have paid little attention to. We will discover that we humans do not own the world, or any part of it. From Psalms 24, verse 1. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. End quote. There is in our human law undeniably the concept and right of land ownership, but this, I think, is merely an expedient to safeguard the mutuality of belonging, without which there can be no lasting and conserving settlement of human communities. This right of human ownership is limited by mortality and by natural constraints upon human attention and responsibility. There'll be a part 2.